What is up, everyone? I am the Mudman, and it's time to figure out what we are going to play this weekend in Gods Unchained. So another week has gone by, we have not received a balance patch, so the meta is pretty much the same as it has been for the past few weeks. We have Deception as the most popular god, then Nature and Magic pretty much the second most popular, then Light, and then Death and War at the bottom. So when you see Deception this weekend, it can either be Control Deception or some variation of Aggro Deception or like Jack of all Trades Deception. I imagine the Jack of all Trades Deception is going to be the most popular, so expect lots of great early game creatures like Armor Lurker as well as cards like Cutthroat. Nature is always Aggro Nature, usually leaning towards some sort of wild synergy package. Then we have Magic, which could be Control Magic, Tempo Magic, or Combo Magic. However, Control Magic is by far the most common of the Magic archetypes, and Control Magic is probably one of the stronger decks in the game right now. And now in the middle we have Zoo Light or Control Light rather. Despite the fact that Light is in the middle of the pack as far as popularity is concerned, the single most popular archetype on the Mythic ladder currently is Zoo Light. So despite the fact that Light's the fourth most popular god, expect lots of Zoo Light over the weekend. Yeah, so Zoo Light definitely the most popular archetype. However, Control Light is very strong as well, but much less prevalent because of how reliant it is on cards like Demogorgon. So definitely plan for some Zoo Light. Then Death is easy. It's always a Nubian Death, and War is always Relic War. So now that we've done that brief generalization of the meta, let's jump into some specific decks you might want to play this weekend. Alright, let's start things off with Deception. I've got two different Deception lists for you guys today. Both of them fit into the Jack of all trades Deception category. We've got a lower curve one and a higher curve one. We're going to start off with the lower curve one because this was the best performing list of last weekend. This Deception list was made by Co, and it's generally like a pretty normal aggro Deception list. We have a lot of very strong early game creatures, most of which have hidden. We got the Armor Lurker, which is great for dealing damage, or just great for any value trade in the early game. Switch Duelist, pretty much the same, although it doesn't value trade, it trades up. We have the Sparrow, great for dealing damage. We have the Encumbered Looter, which, it's hidden, makes it stick around, and then it can trade very successfully with the Subtlest Guildmate. All of those aforementioned creatures are also guild creatures, so they can be buffed by the Subtlest Guildmate as well. We also have two copies of Ludian Thespian in here to buff up your hidden creatures for even more damage. So, you can do that same, like, hard to interact with, play hidden creatures, buff them up, deal lots of damage thing. And then you can also transition into being a little more control-oriented with your one copy of Rapture Dance and then your copy of Cutthroat. If you're playing against a slow deck or a combo deck, you can steal your opponent's unrestrained power, you can steal their Dralamar, you can steal their Land of the Dead, what have you. Or just, your control magic opponents, whatever big thing they have in their hand. Very convenient in this meta right now. Some other cool things of note in this deck is we have a copy of Madame Denholm, which pairs really nicely with a handful of cards in this deck, one of which is the Reflection Elementalist, so you can turn one of the dinky 1/1 she makes into a 3/4 with with Ward. So, for a big, powerful tempo swing. You also have two copies of Uncanny Rogue in here, which also pair well with Madame Denholm's creatures. It's also very powerful with Umber Arrow for 6 mana, so you can steal one of your opponent's things, give it deadly, and kill another one of their things. Extremely powerful. We have two copies of Bound by Her Will in here as well as a copy of Beguiling Blade to steal your opponent's stuff, maybe a Priestess of Taket. Always powerful. Oh, and of course we have two copies of Fermentari Instigator to reload. You've probably noticed the vast majority of the creatures in this deck are guild tribes, so you'll be drawing a bunch of cards off the Fermentari Instigator. All in all, this is a deck that's very strong. You can be extremely aggressive and hard to interact with and just overwhelm your control opponents, or your aggressive opponents. And if you play against some sort of combo deck, you steal their combo. If you somehow lose the board, you can Rapture Dance. A deck like this really has a pretty fair game against everything, and Co proved it last week, going 17 of 18. But now let's take a look at a higher curve variation of this type of Deception list. This deck was made by Mighty Uncle, and as you can see, it's fairly similar. We have a lot of the same powerful early game creatures like Armor Lurker and Beguiling Blade, but this deck has removed all of the various creature buff cards and has replaced it with more stat reduction cards like the two copies of Blade Borrower. And some more value generating cards like Patient Pickpocket as well as Ludia's Dedicant. This deck has two copies of Cutthroat for even more big stealing stuff action. We have one copy of Elixir of the Snake and one copy of Rapture Dance. They both fill pretty much the same role. They clear the board for 6 mana. However, Elixir of the Snake doesn't care about ward or protected creatures, so it's very good at dealing with lights boards. And like I said in the beginning of the video, Zoo Light is a very common archetype, so being able to kill all of their protected creatures is very convenient. And then we transition to the late game where we have some big frontline creatures, like Guild Enforcer, the big dragon, Helmna, and finally Witherfingers. This deck also has Counterfeit, a very convenient control tool, great against Magic to steal their Palace's Wands or their Lightning Talismans. You can take your Death opponent's Necroscepter or a Skull Scepter. Skull Scepter is probably way more common. Against War, you can take their Huge Relic. Lots of great things going on. Whichever type of Deception deck you want to go with, Deception should perform really, really well. They can out-aggro opponents. They can out-control opponents. And they have Cutthroat for stealing stuff. Deception is definitely a very strong archetype. It's been good for the past couple of weeks, and probably be good again this week. Alright, next up we have Control Magic. This Control Magic list was made by Virtual Deity. It is very similar to the Control Magic list we've been featuring for the past couple of weeks. We have lots of AoE as well as single target removal. As far as AoE is concerned, we have 2 Tracking Bolts, 1 Unannounced Arrival, 2 Shape Blast, 2 Stormtresses, which is a creature and AoE, 2 Unbound Flames. This deck has a Circe, which is not particularly common anymore, although it's very strong, especially in this particular build. And then finally we have Mormag for AoE, just lots of AoE, single target removal, and a little bit of ramp in that Crystal Tech Scholar, which is very, very powerful. But the main difference between Virtual Deity's deck here and a common Control Magic list is this deck leans very, very heavily into Metamorphosis. Pretty much all Control Magic decks run Metamorphosis. We're all familiar with the ultimate combo of Mormag on 9 to deal 8 damage to everything, and then turning it into a Nagrius for even more damage. But this deck also runs Circe, which can be incredibly powerful with Metamorphosis. For 8 mana, you can deal 3 damage to everything, force E for 3, and then end your turn with something huge like a Jotun or like a Helion Elite. We also have 2 copies of Magic Inks in here, which presumably gets you more copies of either Metamorphosis or probably something big like Shape Blast. But having many more copies of Metamorphosis is very strong in here because of that aforementioned Crystal Tech Scholar. Turning a 1/1 creature into a random 5 mana creature is very strong. A similar thing can be said with Bibliomaniac. So, at the end of the day, having all these Magic Inks means that you can have, big tempo swing turns throughout the game, having that huge Circe, having that, who knows, something, a Guild Enforcer out of your Crystal Tech Scholar, and then still doing that big Mormag play. Definitely big fun plays that you can do with all of those extra Metamorphoses. And then besides that, we have our standard control stuff. We have 2 copies of City Planner because he's big and makes front lines. We have the Dragon because it's a big front line. We have 2 copies of Demo because it's amazing. So if you are a fan of the Control Magic list and you like metamorphosizing things, then I definitely recommend a list like Virtual Deities here. And now let's move on to Aggro Nature. This Aggro Nature list was made by Crescendo, and he performed very well this past weekend ranked event. He went 16 out of 18. And there's not a ton to say about this Aggro Nature list. It's very standard. You play early game creatures, Wild Hogs, Marshwalkers, Beetles, Black Jaguars. You buff them all up with your Howler. You buff them up all again with your Sing Song Satyr. Then again with your Wildfire. We've got some big wide creatures. 2 copies of Bladefly, 2 copies of Falling Stars to just refill your board. Got a Nefarious Briar to destroy some relics. A lot of relics in the game right now. But, essentially speaking, you're just playing creatures, buffing creatures. You do have the Celestial Stag for some more value. Got the 2 copies of Lightning Strike as well as 2 copies of Canopy Barrage. Both very strong against Deception. Lightning Strike, of course, killing Guild Enforcers, very important in the meta. But if you have played Nature in the past, if you're a fan of Nature, this list is very normal. You've probably played this exact same list in the past. And that's it for Nature. Now we have Control Light. This Control Light list was made by Ryan. And it is very similar to the Control Light list we've talked about in the past. It spends the early parts of the game just slowing everything down with order. We've got pretty much all the different order stuff you could ask for in this deck. We also have 1 copy of Divine Judgment that you can use to obliterate any of those ordered cards. Essentially, all you're doing is stalling out the game till the late game, playing Lysander's Mercy to reset the entire board state, and then you are playing big creatures every single turn with your very powerful Radiant Embalmer plus Inescapable Duty loop. This deck also has a copy of Lysander's Spear, which is, a fun new way to spice up this archetype. Sort of like an alternate win condition, now you can also just buff up a creature and overwhelm your opponent. It's also extra good at the end of the game when you've reset the board. Now you're doing your duty turn. You can now be playing your a 6/8 Radiant Bomber instead of just a 4/6 Radiant Bomber. Same thing is true with Demogorgon. It could be an 8/10 Demogorgon or a 7/7 Highborn Knight. Just a fun inclusion to Control Light. But essentially speaking, this is the same style of Control Light deck we have been used to seeing. Lots of order stuff, lots of stalling stuff, lots of big creatures. So if you're a fan of those slow, grindy Control Light games, this deck should perform very well this weekend ranked event. Alright, and that brings us to War. This is a Relic War deck made by Sifu, and this is pretty much the same as any other Relic War deck we've ever talked about. You draw a big relic in the early game with your I Need a Weapon. Maybe you draw some more cards with Mobilize, maybe you get some mana reduction. Maybe you've even reduced your Unrestrained Power, which you use to buff up your relic and then double its power. Maybe you threw in a Whetstone in there to make the relic even bigger. It's pretty much the same as Nubians. Every game ends pretty much the exact same way with a big weapon. It's just a matter of when they do it. And since we're talking about Nubians, guess which death deck you should play this week if you're looking to play death? That's right, it's Nubians. And, just like that war deck, this deck made by Too Young to Die is very similar to the Anubian decks we've seen in the past. You play your important Anubians like Priestess of Taket and Raving Necromancer. Then you play all of your heirlooms and stuff. You kill off your Anubians. You capitalize off of them dying. We've got lots of card draw in here to make sure you don't brick. 2 copies of Brimstone, 2 copies of Untold Greed, 2 of the Burrowing Scarabs, a single copy of Dangerous Ritual. But with all of this card drawing here, you should have no problem drawing all of your Nubians and whatnot. Then you play your Land of the Dead, get all your Nubians back, kill them all off again, deal lots of damage. Almost forgot to mention the Skull Scepter in here to capitalize even further off all of your dying creatures. And this deck has 2 copies of Bifracturing Curse, which is fairly uncommon. This player has been doing particularly well with this list for the past week. The win rate all in all is only 59%. But over this past week, this player has played like 20 games with like an 88% win rate or something along those lines. Anubians have proven week after week they are a pretty strong archetype. They are very hard to play around. Their opponents punish for killing creatures. Their opponents punish for leaving creatures up. There's not much you can really do. Just throw in your important Anubians, throw in your heirloom cards, put in some card draw, then close your eyes and click until your deck is finished, and Anubian should do fairly well. But yeah, that is about it for the death. Let's jump on into the conclusion. Alright, so it is conclusion time. We've looked at all the tabs. We've done all the talking. We've bled GUDecks.com dry of all pertinent information. What deck should we play this weekend ranked in Gods Unchained? Well, the answer is clear. Jack of all trades, Aggro Deception is the winner. This deck can do it all. Jack of all trades, master of everything. But whatever deck you go with, try to have fun. Tell us how you did in the TST Discord and have a wonderful day. Hey, you! Did you know that subscribing to the TST YouTube channel will increase your win rate by 6.9%? So what are you waiting for? Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell for notifications. And while you're at it, equip Scythe of the Harvest and attack the like button directly in the face. Bye-bye!